In the mid-1800s, mines were being opened all over the coal-rich hills of Pennsylvania. The demand for coal power from the East Coast was ever growing. These mines built towns all through this coal region. Centralia, Pennsylvania was one such small town. Things had changed there in the 100 years since the first coal mine had opened. In the 1960s, there were about 1,200 people that lived there. They had shops and a good local economy, and had left the rough past behind that was so common amongst small mining towns. Back then, the area was so rich in coal that some of the coal came near to the surface. Ironically, it was the city council that ended up making the decision that would cause the town of Centralia to become a ghost town. The city council proposed a cleanup of the town landfill in time for the Memorial Day festivities. Their method of cleaning up the landfill was to burn it in big piles of trash. Unknowingly, the landfill sat right on top of a coal seam that was connected to 25 million tons of underground coal. The fire spread into the ground, into the mine tunnels, and all through the city. In spite of their best efforts, the fire has never been extinguished. Over time, the temperatures of the ground grew. It started with abnormally warm winter temperatures. Residents didn't have to shovel their sidewalks. They were even able to grow tomatoes in the late winter. Then it killed the trees and the plant life. Smoke began seeping into basements and toxic fumes steamed out of the ground. The heat grew so intense, some parts of the town reached 900 degrees. That fire is still burning underground and will burn for the next 250 years. The King's Hall podcast exists to make self-ruled men who rule well and win the world.
Well, that Centralia mine fire basically made the city of Centralia a ghost town, right? It went from over 1,000 residents to a handful now living in that region today, almost swallowed up some of the citizens, almost miraculously. Nobody's been killed by it that we know of, at least. I guess if some hobo wandered in and fell through a hole, we probably wouldn't be aware of it. So why do we tell that story at the beginning of this episode? Well, last week we looked at one of the shanty towns that we're going to need to clear from our job site if we're going to put up this great cathedral of Christendom. And that shanty town last week that we covered was revivalism and decisionism, this culture of revivalism and decisionism, particularly that grew up over the last 200 years or so out of the Second Great Awakening. It's flourished in America, and it has been highly informative of much of the megachurch culture, big, fast, and famous culture, much of the rot that has gone through the remnants of the old Christendom. And so the picture in my mind, as I'm thinking about what's happened to Christianity over the last few centuries, is kind of like that Centralia mine fire. Because we had this great, glorious Western civilization that was really built by Christians doing Christian things, Some of the greatest art, music, and civilization that's ever been produced in the history of mankind was produced by this old Christendom. But then, many different seams of coal under the ground, it seems like, caught fire and slowly burned out the foundations underneath and crumbled from the ground down, really, that old Christendom. And so today, as we think through our building project, we're not just asking, where did revivalism and decisionism go wrong? But what we'd like to do now is sort of counterpoint that and say, well, contra revivalism and decisionism, what would we build? Let's say we've cleared that shanty town out of the way of revivalism and decisionism. What would we do differently today? What are we going to build in its place? And so today we'll organize this conversation around 3 fairly long-winded sentences because I wrote them. So they're fairly long-winded.
Do they have lots of commas?
Just like 15 or 16 commas, a couple M dashes, semicolons.
All right.
They're not that long, They're not like Paul, the apostle.
Semicolon?
Semicolons.
Not semicolon?
Demiquaver.
You know what? Read your sentence.
Okay. I'll read all 3 of them, and then we'll back up and go through each one of them and unpack it and talk it through. So the first heading that we'll discuss today is that where revivalism and decisionism produce unstable and emotionalistic disciples. The new Christendom will be marked by men and women who are sober-minded and stable. So we're going to talk about some of the emotionalism of that model, why it needs to go, and what ought to replace it. Number 2, where revivalism and decisionism produce a culture of apocalyptic thinking and cultural decline, the new Christendom will be built on 40,000-year thinking and conquest thinking. And then finally, where revivalism and decisionism produce a culture of restorationism and novelty, the new Christendom will be marked by covenantal thinking and historically rooted Catholicity. And so we're going to talk about the emotionalism of revivalism and what should replace it. We're going to talk about the apocalyptic cultural decline narrative of revivalism and what ought to replace it. And then we'll talk about the restorationism and novelty and what ought to replace it. Let's start with that heading concerning instability and emotionalism. Revivalism has tended to make an intense and emotional fervor sort of the default vision for spiritual health, right? And we talked about this last week, where the goals and the setting for much of the revivalism of the Second Great Awakening were camp meetings or church meetings, community meetings that would be self-consciously aimed at whipping up the audience into a fervor, right? An emotional fervor, or an emotional anxiety, like deep wells of anxiety, to which they would offer this decisionistic gospel presentation as the answer. So maybe we should start with this question, guys. How has revivalism promoted emotional instability? Where have you seen this? And what has been the result of this? Maybe so that as we're saying what we should build instead, we can kind of start with some of the bad things we don't want to see.
Yeah, I was thinking about this question, reading through the New Testament, particularly the pastoral epistles. And Paul actually talks a lot about this with Timothy, with a young man, how to be stable. You don't want to be shifting on sand. You don't want to be tossed to and fro by the waves. And one of the things that he always talks about is doctrine, right? There's a doctrine that leads to godliness. There's a doctrine that produces, and the word Paul uses over and over, in the English at least, is soundness or health. Mm-hmm. And so for the young man, especially young men can be tumultuous, right? And a lot of young people tend to be given, I think, to the revivalism and the fervor of that. Instead of that, we're really looking for doctrinal foundations. So I think that's somewhere near the heart of the issue, is being doctrinally rooted and grounded. One of the things in my own personal life, as I moved away from revivalism and sort of the emotionalistic experiences we talked about last week, it really was being, okay, now we're going to be more grounded in historical, Reformed, Calvinistic thought. It's less and less about your personal experience, and then it's more and more about solid teaching. So Dan, I know you're a pastor. You do a lot of teaching in the church along with Brian. Would you agree with that? And have you seen that bear fruit in the life of the body as you're leaning more into sound teaching?
I just want to say both of you sound really stodgy and boring and dry.
What?
Man, your long sentences with big words, man, snooze fest. I thought you were like a Twitter star. Don't you have to be like pithy and punchy? No, here. So the history is you got something you want to tell me?
I do, Dan.
Award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Yeah. May God have mercy on my soul, actually.
I think that's actually what you were saying to us.
No, here's the thing. You're right. Historic rootedness does provide, like a ballast in a ship, prevents it from swaying too much one direction or another. Or like I've heard the illustration that this emotionalism produces men that are like drunk dudes riding a horse. Yeah. They just like swing from one side to the next. But what it's done personally to me, and we'll talk about assurance, I'm sure, throughout this whole thing, assurance of salvation, you're standing in Christ, things like that, is that if growing up, I was instructed, you're supposed to have these experiences. How are you feeling? How are you doing with your relationship with God? Expecting some sort of like miracle to happen.
Yeah.
When I sit down and read the Bible in the morning in my quiet time, I'm like, boy, I'm in Leviticus in my Bible reading plan, and I'm not feeling it. This morning, what's wrong? I must not be right.
Yeah.
God, what is going on? What am I doing? Why are you far from me? I start sounding like David in one of the Psalms. that's like, don't depart from me. I'm like, no, dude, you need to tell your emotions, to obey your knowledge and to obey your doctrine. You need to have your emotions bridled. And so what it really did to me, and I know what the fruit that it's produced in other people that I've pastored, is that the expectations aren't on the emotional experience. The expectations aren't on yourself. You're not self-focused when you're doing things like reading the scriptures, because they're not primarily about you. You're not reading yourself into the story all the time, right? It's God declaring in his word who he is and what he's like and what he's done and what he'll do and things like that. And so it's really given me a better grounding or a rootedness to provide stability. And I know, like you said, it's done that for you as well. The historically rooted portion of it, I think, is really important, because when you look with humility at the past, assuming that, people in the past weren't just dirt munchers, that they actually built some of the most amazing buildings, wrote some of the most amazing works of literature, performed some of the most beautiful music. You can look back at them who've thought great thoughts that have been around for hundreds of years, that have proven themselves. And you look to those men and think, okay, what great thoughts have these men thought? What did they think about the scriptures? What is my inheritance of the faith? What are my spiritual fathers and mothers thinking in the past? And have produced the fruit that we've seen over a few hundred years. And that's why we're really skeptical of anything that's modern, is because the fruit is bad. And so that's what I would say as far as the sorts of changes that have happened to me personally and the teachings that have produced fruit in the church.
Yeah, I think one of the other things, Dan, as you were talking about that really came to mind. I was listening to a podcast the other day with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and we'll need some sound effects on that one, Brian.
Wow.
Absolutely, yeah. This is me, Arnold Schwarzenegger.
The Schwarzenegger.
Were you being serious?
I literally was.
Arnold.
It was actually really good. So one of the things he talked about, the guy said...
By the way, why is it everybody can do an Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Run! Go! Get to the chopper!
Impression, but he can't say California.
California.
Yeah, it's weird. Huh?
Anyway, sorry, continue.
Yeah, that's a good question. We'll have to see if we can reach out to him. And
Next episode,
Arnold.
we'll have him on.
Arnold. We'll get some sound design for that one.
Yeah, there you go.
So, yeah, one of the things he was talking about, though, in the podcast was the guy asked him, he said, I don't know how old he is now, 70s, something like that. He's getting up there, but he's still working out.
Mr. Universe.
Yeah, he's still working out. Works out every day. And the guy asked him, he said, why do you work out every day? And he said, because I did yesterday and the day before. And I did that every day for the last 30 years. That's what I do. That's my routine. And you'll hear this a lot in the fitness communities. Like a lot of young guys, a lot of guys who aren't trained, they want to rely on motivation. Am I motivated today to go to the gym? And the guys who are really good, they're at the top of their game physically, they will all say, it's not about motivation, it's about discipline. It's about self-control. It doesn't matter if you feel like going to the gym.
It's almost like Neverland or like Peter Pan, like find your happy thought.
Yeah.
Just hold that happy thought in your mind.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you work. No, that's not how it works.
And that's the reality. We mentioned the book Desiring God, but again, that focus on your religious experience being like kind of the grounding for how you're doing. And the reality is, as we grow up and as we become men, I mean, what I know I do to my boys, what do we say all the time? We say, they say, but Dad, I don't feel like it. And I look at them and I say, it absolutely doesn't matter. It's our duty and we're going to do it.
Yeah.
And we're going to pray for strength and we're going to do it. Again, back to this principle of maturity means discipline, not necessarily relying on how you feel in the moment.
Yeah. Revivalism has produced emotional instability in the sense that the very environment and call to action that you're continually hearing is like, get to the next level with God, recommit to God, you're not zealous enough. I think this is even the great grandfather of things like radical David Platt and some of this stuff where it's like the real Christians are, overseas missionaries, and they're continually like when they worship God, they're raising their hands and they're swaying with the music because they're just overwhelmed with emotional response to God and spiritual fervor and all of that sort of thing. But the reality is God hasn't actually made human beings to work like that. right? Like God hasn't actually made people to live there for very long. And even if you think about it, if you make that the standard, then you will be tempted to continually try to create that. Or if you can't create it, and you know in the culture of whatever group of people you're in, if your in-group, your tribe is like, well, all of the greatest among us are, they're continually weeping during worship, or they're continually, in their quiet time, they're having visions and prophecies and et cetera. What are you going to be tempted to do?
Yeah.
Make stuff up, pretend,
Yeah.
put on a show.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think one of the books that I read on this years ago, it kind of brings these, revivalistic culture versus whatever we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
It's the collision of these two cultures. It's a short book, but definitely recommend it. It was Kevin DeYoung, and it was called Just Do Something. So this especially comes up with the will of God stuff.
Great book.
And so Kevin was talking about all these kids. I think he was near Michigan State at the time. All these kids that would come to church, and they're like, what's the will of God for my life? And he says, they're looking for a liver shiver. They're looking for this experience.
They open the Bible and they're
calling, like a deep calling.
Yeah, well, God.
I've been having dreams.
The still small whisper.
I turned to Esther and it said, for such a time as this.
And I
this
knew
is the time.
that I was to dump her.
I need to go.
And I knew that I was to dump her.
Yeah.
So in the book, he compares that to kind of the traditional Reformed view of like, how do you make a decision? But again, it's really this revivalistic versus stable, Reformed, historical, covenantal view of life coming together. One of the things he points out is he compares those young people doing that to his grandfather. And he's, Dutch Reformed people in Michigan. He said, look, they were like, well, where can I get a job? And so that's where I'm going to work. There was not this agonizing over, well, what is my emotional
destiny?
State? Yeah, what's my destiny? They were like, well, this woman was a friend of mine and she wasn't dating anyone. So I dated her and I liked her. So I married her.
And that was it.
And what you find is that was actually far more stable.
Yeah.
Though less emotionally exhilarating.
So getting really practical, what we're talking about over against revivalistic emotional instability is that a true Christendom that's durable and lasting is going to, like we've been saying the whole time, it's going to be built on men and women who are mastered by the Spirit of God, who are just godly Christians, living as godly Christians in the vocations and duties that God has given them. And so what you're describing is actually, I think, really practically helpful. Is that when you're thinking about, okay, how can I walk in alignment with this? And basically what you're describing is saying, well, you start with your duties. You start with your duties from how God created you.
Yeah, start with general principles.
Yeah.
This is actually an old Martin Lloyd-Jones. He would always say this as a doctor. Start with the general. Okay, I know as a man I'm called to do X, Y, and Z in Scripture. That much is clear, right? Because we always want to start with the like hyper-specific.
Yeah.
Is the will of God to be in the military or in a special branch of the military?
Yeah, or should I take the job with Amazon, or should I, go be a grocery clerk? Or
yeah, and ultimately the things that God has made clear is, right, as a man, we talk about it all the time, but you're to be a provider and a protector. Can you do that? Wherever, what does God say? Whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might.
Yeah.
So can you find a job, and can you do that job with all your might? That's the question.
Yeah. And will this job provide for your duties, for you to fulfill your duties? If so, well, then great. Start there. And maybe you'll find something better. And maybe you'll think strategically and you'll get the next thing. But so much of our Christian culture is rooted in this kind of mystical, spiritual emotionalism, where it uses your emotions as sort of like the weather vane that point you. And the problem with that is that that's not what God designed our emotions to be and do.
Well, it's interesting because we've said before that culture, the stream flows out of the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell downstream, even in the world, the way that they act, what's coming out of the pulpits. And so it should be of no surprise to us that within the mega church or the mainstream Christianity sort of culture, that you see similarities with the secular world, in which they will try to have some sort of experience to bring up feelings of virtue or of purity. And you see these overt displays, whether it's on social media or in person, with, I don't know, say like COVID and wearing a mask or having Ukraine and the Ukraine flag in your social media page or something like that. And so you can see all these virtues signaling throughout all of the culture because of the same sorts of things that the church has been discipling people over a long time. Is instead of doing something productive in your duties, is that you're always chasing the next emotional high to feel like you're doing something for the greater good. And so you can even see that seeping into the church culture today.
Yeah.
And they are forgetting their duties. And so that's why they swing wildly from one thing to the next.
I was going to say, I think another fundamental principle that I would kind of use to underpin all of this is Matthew 28, right? In the Great Commission, we want to teach them all that Jesus commanded. And I had an Old Testament professor say this, and he said, no, pause. Don't just read over that, but pause and think about this for a minute. How long would it take you to teach someone and to obey it all that Jesus commanded? We're talking about lifetime work, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about stuff that's going to take a lifetime. So then I want to apply that, Dan, to this situation on politics. It's really easy to slap a Ukraine or France or whatever the country of the moment is, slap a profile, little image on there.
I support the current thing.
I support whatever the current thing is. But you know what's really hard is to read Samuel Rutherford on politics, government, king, and the law of God. That is going to take a long time. You're not going to arrive at a political position overnight. But I think where we are culturally is we have people who've been catechized by the culture, like Pavlov's dog. You just shake the bell and they're like, okay, we'll do whatever they just told us to respond to. And what we're actually saying is we want to be guided by principle, not emotion, fundamentally. I would say that emotions are as check engine lights, indicators on the dash. They're helpful, but they're not good when they're a compass.
Yeah.
They're not good when they're the directions.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to steer your life based on your emotions. But again, it gets back to this whole thing of if we want to dig into subjects, all the world for Christ, you want to dig into these subjects, political and otherwise, it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of reading, a lot of study, a lot of conversation.
And when you've been trained by, instead of being trained by your duties and the word of God and all that Christ commanded. So what has Christ commanded me to be and do as a man, a husband, a father, a churchman? What has God commanded, a lady to do as a woman, a mother, maybe a wife, a worker at home, all of these things, instead of being trained by our duties plus the scriptures, aiming for long-term plodding stability in that, we've been trained by emotionalism. So let's make decisions based on emotionalism, and let's make the target that we're aiming for this spectacular, big, spectacular, radical things for Jesus. And that's what spiritual health looks like. This is why you see, I remember some years back, there was a young lady in the church, and she was coming out of high school, going in her, adult years, just right on the cusp there. And it was like the thing that she was convinced she needed to do was find the mission field where she could go. Was it YWAM, or was it this thing, or was it that thing? And I remember
or a household.
Yeah. And the pastors were like, I just remember as we were counseling the father and like trying to point the ship, but knowing that we're not going to make the decision for her and for the family. It's like, what about just stable, steadfast pursuing of things like, well, maybe being a wife and being a mother, and maybe what about that?
It's just not flashy enough.
But it's not as flashy as going overseas on the missions field and that sort of thing.
Well, think about the language even, right? So David Platt, that whole movement, radical.
Yeah.
Even Mark Driscoll, I never really liked the language, but they're like, be a rebel for God. And I get where he was going with it, but this whole language of rebellion and radical.
Yeah.
And realistically, what we're saying is faithful and plotting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and a lot of what we've been captured by, and where we see a lot of fruit in our church and just through our ministries, and is that part of the issue has been the framing of the Missio Dei, the framing of the vision for Christianity and for even the individual. What do you exist to do? And so when we tell women, you know what you should do? You should be workers at home.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds terrible to a lot of women.
Boring.
It sounds really boring. It's a lot better to climb the corporate ladder, to make the next big sale, or to do whatever the heck it is you want to do.
Yeah.
And it sounds inglorious to stay at home and cook dinner. But but it's all in the framing of the vision. You were made for a purpose. And I know we'll get really practical about this, but the fact that women, you stay home, you have babies, you can create eternal beings. They have eternal souls. You make life in your body, and then you sustain life with your body. And that eternal soul will go on. Obviously, it's eternal. It will live forever. And your children and your grandchildren and your great-great-grandchildren will, and your descendants will fill the land. I mean, if God causes you to prosper, God bless you. That's the mission.
Yeah.
And so this is why it's so attractive, right? And this is to the eternal creature, is because you can outlast your own life.
Yeah.
And it's ultimately not for your own glory.
So it's like revivalistic culture. It uses a truth to mislead.
Yeah.
The truth is that you should want to be a part of something glorious and radically glorious. You should actually want to be participating in something that is, in the aggregate, not mundane at all. It's glorious. But then it uses that to say, and so you're every Sunday at church and every worship experience and every, devotional time and every day should be marked by radical emotional highs, and it should be marked by, and what that actually produces is it's actually the spiritual cultural equivalent of a meth addict, right? Or a heroin addict.
Yeah, you're always looking for the next
They're
high.
artificially flooding their brain with pleasure chemicals and then living for that as if that, and it ups your level of normal. And so no wonder we're just depressed and feel like we're not getting anything done.
It's the complete opposite of stability.
Complete opposite.
Right? Those people, and I've been that person, at least in the spiritual revivalistic sense.
Pardon the interruption here, but I have some great news for you. If you like high-quality Christian media, like the King's Hall podcast, of course, then we would invite you to help us continue to make this show possible. You can support the show at kingshall.org. We've got a Patreon account. We've got also a store now where you can buy some awesome Season 1 Boniface-themed merch. You can get a Boniface mug, a Boniface T-shirt where he's chopping down a tree, which for some reason is rainbow colored. I'll have to ask why our designer decided to do that. I'm kind of confused about the color choice there. Also, if you jump on our Patreon and support us there, you get access to every week an entirely patron-exclusive show called After Hours, where we talk about all sorts of things. In fact, in an upcoming After Hours episode, we're going to discuss why we even use a company like Patreon to help support the show when they're out there canceling creators, and seems like we'd be the kind of creators that they would love to cancel. And there is a very strategic reason why we do that. So sign up for Patreon, check it out there, and you can learn more. But with that said, back to the show.
I was just thinking about this, though, as we were talking about it. Dan, you were talking about this. I think fundamentally, when we have collision between like Brian and Twitter, particularly Brian and Christian Twitter, and even a lot of the stuff I say in Christian Twitter, what I think it's really happening is it's this revivalistic faith versus reformed, sound, historical things. Like, again, you could think of like the household versus, whatever the thing in the moment in Christianity is novel, new, and sexy.
Yeah.
Right? Because what are we saying that really ticks people off? Put some clothes on and be a mom and be faithful.
That's good.
That's really not a sexy thing.
Yeah.
In today's culture.
And so wrapping up this first section here, because we're starting to overlap with some of the things that we need to discuss in the next headings here. But when we're talking about, anti-revivalist culture, anti-emotional instability, we're talking about men who are emotionally stable, they understand their duties, and they seek to obey God in the duties that God has given them in a stable, plodding way. And so think about some practical ways, men, that you could fight against this emotionalistic, do great things kind of mentality. A lot of you guys jump from job to job way too quick. You're like thinking that the next job is going to be the answer, or the next move, or sometimes even like, if I could just move to this place to be a part of this church, or if I could just go do this thing. And it's like, before you hastily jump from thing to thing, make sure that you are stable, right? Make sure that you are pursuing your duties. And then if you need to move, or if you need to make a change in order to pursue long-term fruitful stability and obedience to your duties, then do that. but make sure that it's not a longing to be radical or a longing to be, like do something glorious for the kingdom. Make sure that you're not, actually still walking in the vestiges of the ways that we've all been discipled by this revivalistic thinking. And same ladies, same for you. I think lots of women, again, they young ladies come up out of high school and they think, I need to go do something big for the kingdom. And it's like, well, what if the big thing that you're supposed to do is to be a small, insignificant part, little yeast cell in this whole great grand story that God is telling? And what if the whole story is glorious, but our glorious part of it is just going to probably be pretty mundane a lot of the time?
Yeah, and what if Mother Teresa was right? She said, if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. I think she was right. And it's funny because when you say that, a lot of women are kind of like, it's kind of like deflating.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh yeah, I guess that's what we're gonna go do.
Yeah, it's like, am I saying like, oh, I just want to have these really good emotional, spiritual times with God, and yet I'm short with my kids?
Yeah,
I mean, usually the work that's most worth doing is not great in the moment. I mean, the guys we've talked about that build cathedrals, the work stinks.
Oh yeah,
stonework stinks. I've never done it, but I bet it stinks anyway. I mean, rocks are heavy.
Yeah,
kids,
they're not malleable.
I have so many kids at home right now. They're so little, and it's really hard.
Yeah.
My poor wife, man, she needs all the help she can get. It's really hard. It's kind of hard, and you have moments that are great.
Yeah, it's ditch digging work a lot of time.
But what you have to do is look beyond the moment. You have to look beyond the moment at the actual work that you're doing.
Yeah, look at what you're a part of and what it's contributing to.
Yeah, so making meals, going to a job that you don't really like, doing work that you don't think is that important, in the moment, it's not satisfying. But like you said, Brian, what if you're just that yeast cell, and your job is to do what you're supposed to do, your duties, to the best of your ability, to the glory of God, and to become really good at what you do, even if it's, man, you're doing data entry. You're going to be the best dang data entryist that's ever existed.
Yeah.
You will not stand before obscure men. You'll stand before kings.
Yeah.
And ultimately,
you'll be entering their data.
Yeah.
The data of kings.
The data of kings.
No, you're going to stand before the King of Kings one day.
That's right.
And so it's all about beyond the moment.
Yeah.
Whereas revivalism is in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the moment. What am I experiencing? What am I feeling?
And there are guys, I think we've all seen this. And I think even our tribes can tend to produce this kind of guy. This is why I'm specifically pointing at this. Throwing a rock at this, I think it's an idol. That's related to this revivalistic, I'm going to do something big kind of emotionalistic thinking. It's guys that they're not doing a great job with their basic duties. Like a man who doesn't provide for his family has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Literally a verse in the Bible. According to Paul.
Man.
Yeah, it's harsh in their vibe.
Oof.
And then they're like, yeah, but I'm going to go to seminary. I should go to seminary. I should, you know what? I should spend $75 this week on new theology books to not read.
What's funny, Brian, is that's actually what I did.
I'm describing for past Eric. I'm sorry, Eric.
No, it really is. I mean, I look back on that time period and I think, man, that was so foolish. And just not having, people around. I read Don't Waste Your Life and went to seminary at, 19 years old and was like, I'm going to be a pastor at 22 and this will be great.
Is that a bad idea, being a pastor at 22?
Yeah, I typically believe that elders should be a little elder.
I should, I need to call my past self. We both need to call our past selves. No,
Yeah,
that's so true.
And God's gracious. The other thing I wanted to speak to though, you were talking about, making lots of life transitions.
Yeah.
I look back at my life, especially in the 20s, but 20s through mid 30s. And one of the things I would say is I didn't realize this for a long time. It was much later that I started reading up on what was going on in job markets and what was going on in corporate America and understanding like, I'm actually not the anomaly that people want to move every 2.5 years. And it's not even the want to, that's what corporate life is like now. That's the average job to move up, to advance. You have to move jobs. What I would say though, if I could go back to 20 is in order to be stable, you have to have ground that is stable.
Yeah.
So the thing is, I've looked back on it and I said, what's interesting is the jobs are not stable. But what is stable is finding a church, finding a community, burning the boats, being there, planting your flags, planting your roots deep.
Yeah.
And then saying, you know what, no matter what happens, I can find work.
I'm going to do my duties here.
Yes. And so I would say for us, like our family, we bounced around for a long time. And I didn't understand it. And then, of course, we came here. And it sounds kind of cliche, but I think in coming here, it was like, yeah, you have to have the kind of community that roots you.
Yeah.
And then literally that is what is providing the bedrock of stability for the rest of your life. So I think it really is a priority issue.
Yeah.
And again, as I was going through those decisions, I was talking with Dan and I was like, I don't know what that was my thinking. I was like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do in the next 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And Dan was like, well, what are you doing in the next 50, 100 years?
Right.
Like think different.
Yep.
So I think that's one way that you can be more stable too.
Yeah. Think about 50, 100 years. And then you're going to have your duties that you need to do today.
Mm-hmm.
Like you got to feed your family today, but make sure that you're actually also thinking about what your duties to your family are for the next 50 years and 100 years.
And where can you do that? Church community, brothers, gang of men.
If you can't do that where you're at, then we're not saying just stay where you are. Don't ever move. Just be stable. So don't move. That's not what we're saying. Sometimes stability requires radical near-term action for the sake of long-term stability.
Yeah. You have to look at the soil.
Yeah.
And because I bring it up because I hear this from a lot of guys where it's like, well, we've been in this community forever and my wife's parents are here or my husband's parents are here and the church is really bad, but we're just hoping for reform.
Yeah. Keep hoping.
And it's like, you've been there 15 years. You haven't seen reform. What are there any signs that reform would come? No, the pastor hates us. So do the elders. And this is where we're at. And so, I think for that guy to find stability, he might actually have to.
He might have to realize
move.
he doesn't have it where he's at.
Right. And then at that point, then you're thinking through, okay, well, our job stability. I would answer no, typically.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if that's not stability, what is?
Yeah, that's right. The job
church,
is not the
community. Stability. I would argue like Christian education of some form.
Yeah.
Support there. And then you can start branching out from there.
And what happens when you have that, when you actually have that Christian community, is that just like a plant that has really good soil
mm-hmm.
and is in a really good ecosystem that's functioning with the whole environment vertically, horizontally integrated, is that you are more fruitful. And you start, like the thing is, if you get to a really good church community, a really good Christian community like this, your vocation may very well change for the better just because of the connections that you make through the church, where all of a sudden you're like, and even like the music that I do, I wouldn't have done it without Dan. I wouldn't be doing, and now this is like a thing that I actually do devote real time to because it's actually like not a side hustle, but it's, I'm making productive properties, songs that I can put out and if people still listen to them, maybe one or two of them in 50 years, I'll be able to say, Here, kids, here's a song. You own the royalty rights to it, that kind of thing. I wouldn't be doing that if Dan hadn't walked in the office and been like, hey, that's not a bad setting of Psalm 100. You should do that. Right? So you just don't know the things that are going to happen in terms of long-term growth and the direction that God will mold you if you're just lone rangering it somewhere. It's really hard to be stable as a lone ranger.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that revivalism has produced is radical individualism.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so every man is his own island. He is looking for his experience, he's
his own
barometer.
pope.
He
decides
his own
doctrine.
man. Yeah, I know that's a whole nother rabbit trail, but when you find that sort of community, one of the duties of men is to love your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in a community that has fertile ground, you have like-minded people that are rowing in the same direction, and you love your people, it creates a stability.
Yes.
It really does.
Oh.
Because then there are men in our church who are thinking, what would it look like to buy a city block in Ogden? How could we provide housing for Christian brothers and sisters so that they could actually live here?
Yeah.
And not
they're actually already
afford to live
they've
here.
started.
And they've already started.
It's not even just like a thought.
But they're investing their time and their energy and their resources, lots of money, lots of time into building something, not just for themselves, but and in some cases, not even only for their generations, but also for the community. And so they're thinking community minded. And for these guys, they're producing a ton of fruit. And what it does is it raises the level, like you said, of the people around you, because they see activity happening. You're like, what? Wait a minute. There's a lot of movement over here. What's going on? Holy smokes. I want to do that too. Or how can I help? Or, hey, like, you're sitting around and you're not working. Would you like to work? Because you seem like a capable guy. I mean, there's so many opportunities.
It's like this. Picture you decide that you want to do something great. And the great thing you're going to do, let's say you're living in 1400 Spain, and you're like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go discover new worlds. So you hop in a canoe and you start paddling your way out across the ocean, and the waves are lapping against you, and you feel the wind blowing, and you're like, this is glorious. Look, I'm in my canoe. I'm making good ground, 3-4 miles an hour. You start doing the math. You're like, I don't know where I'm going to go, but I'm going to get somewhere good pretty quick. And then, about 12 hours into the thing, you start realizing that you've made a very poor decision. And praise God, though, you see approaching you from behind a great galleon. Is that what they're called? Galleons?
A galley.
Galley? The big ship? Isn't it a galleon, a Spanish galleon?
Sure.
Look it up.
Yeah, Spanish
galleon. We're going to go with that.
Yeah.
A great sailing
Galley
ship.
is in. That's where I would be.
The galley's in the.
That's where the
where I'd
food
be.
is.
That's right. Amen.
Yes.
Clinking glasses. Amen. And you see it approaching you, and the light's failing, and you wave your hands, and they come and they pull your sorry butt into the big Spanish galleon. And
it is a galleon, by the way. They're
Thank
large, multi-deck sailing ships, first used by the European states from 16th to 18th centuries.
Wow, so I'm anachronistic in my time frame, but let's just go with it. And they pull you up into it, and you say, wow, guys, thank you. Where are you going? And you see this deck. It's full of sailors. There's like 60 guys up here making this big ship go. And they're like, oh, we're going on a quest of discovery we're questing for the new world. And you're like, can I be in on this? And that's what it's like. It's when if you're just saying, I'm going to go do something great for Christendom, and it's just you're a guy in a canoe trying to get across the ocean. But if you've got a church, even if it's 100 people, you could actually do it. Like you might get there.
I feel like that whole story was just for sound effects.
No.
Yeah, so you could sound engineer it.
And I
So
would also
I
say-
could hear the gulls and the
Can you?
waves and
Can
everything
you?
like that.
Dan, I could hear it too.
Yeah, okay, I'll let you talk.
But the illustration was apt.
I was going to say, totally worth it, though.
yeah,
absolutely
it
an
was
apt
good.
illustration.
No, it's so many decisions. Brian and I and the elders of the church and a bunch of other people have had to make decisions, and we're like, if we make this decision, if we continue to reform the church, we're going to lose people. I mean, that's just,
some people
there's
are
a
gonna
cost to leading and making changes. And ultimately we came down to, like, we're convinced these are the right decisions. And if we just had 10 families, if we had 10 families, 10 men that are in, and they're going to put their hands to the plow, and we're all going to go the same direction, man, we could gain so much ground.
Oh, yeah.
All it would take is 10 men. So it doesn't even have to be a huge, everybody is attracted to these places like Moscow or wherever,
right.
And in a lot of ways, I've heard this illustration before. In some places you keep your cattle penned with fencing, but in areas like West Texas, they have thousands of acres. And so they have a watering tank, and they keep the cattle close because there's the water.
They have to go to water.
Yeah, and in this time that we live in, there are places throughout the U.S. that are like these watering holes, right? And so people keep going to these places. And the fact of the matter is, and I think that's great, but you don't have to go to the biggest place in order to have an effect or to find a community. Just 10 men can be all the difference.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is we're talking about stability, plugging in. I think for a lot of guys, I've talked to them. I was this guy for a long time. Like, you see these communities from afar, you think, okay, it's too good to be true. It can't possibly be that good. And so literally for 15 years, we did the Lone Ranger.
Yeah.
Sort of. I mean, we were part of churches and, but to find like what we're describing in this podcast, it's actually really hard, right? There's not many churches. We were talking to a brother the other day who said maybe 50 good churches, like really good churches in America. There's a lot of big churches.
Yeah.
But how many churches are actually a part of this legacy building historical church? And I think the answer is not many. But the other thing that I would say to it is, like for us coming here, we literally had, I think I was baptized as an infant, but really came to like faithful Christianity 2006, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
From that point till we moved here, pretty much every church was a disaster of some sort. And I talked to other people, and I think they've experienced similar things. And so then you get this sour taste in your mouth where you think it's just not possible. There's no
cynical.
good churches. Yeah, you get really cynical. And then we moved here, and I was like, okay, no, it actually exists. So I think part of it is hope for people.
Yeah.
We talk about in post-mill theology, people will say, well, that's great in theory.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people just need to experience that it is real.
Mm-hmm.
There are men pushing the plow forward, making progress.
Yeah.
Not everybody's losing right now.
That's right. And it takes a lot of, like, people also don't realize that it takes, the cynics, might come to a place like Ogden and realize pretty quick that we're not there yet.
Not perfect.
They'll start meeting people. They're like, well, you're not finished. You're not a finished product yet. You don't agree with me on every single thing. You're not, that person, wow, they did something I don't like. I don't think, I heard a podcast that said that families should do this for family worship, and that family, wow, I don't even think they're doing that at all. And wow, they're Credo Baptists over there, and he's a Paedo Baptist. And all of a sudden it's like, if you want to find something to fuss about, you can fuss about it. People don't realize, though, that the best communities are just boringly ordinary. But what makes them glorious is this shared vision and mission, where it's like each one of us knows that we're not significant, but we know that together, if we actually band together and aim for this just mere Christendom kind of thing, God might actually do something glorious in our city or in our place over the next 100 years. And what it's going to take along the way, it's like we just had a meeting this morning, for an elders meeting early this morning, and we're talking about all these problems in the church and discipline, and we got to reach out to that person, and we got to counsel that person, and we got to pull that person back, and we got to get rid of that. I mean, that guy someone needs to thump him with their shepherd staff. And it's like, this is every month at Refuge Church. This is every month at our church here. We're doing that kind of stuff. And if you were here, you'd understand that. But the secret sauce is this new Christendom is going to be built on 40,000 year thinking, conquest thinking, but not like I'm going to be Caleb by myself charging the hill necessarily, but recognize that Caleb is with the whole people that are crossing over into the land.
Yeah, including his children.
It's going to be generations. So what revivalism has done, this is really, we've been already talking about that second heading a lot. Let me remind you of what that second heading was. And we'll continue the conversation here, that revivalism and decisionism produces a culture, and just demonstrably has produced a culture of apocalyptic thinking and a narrative of cultural decline. And so against that, the new Christendom is going to be built on 40,000 year thinking and conquest thinking. So when you think about that Centralia mine fire, this is another image that I get in my head when I think about what revivalism has produced in culture. It's like that. And specifically, it's like this great massive coal seam burning under your Christendom, because the narrative is decline. The narrative is that the world is just going to burn down, and then we're going to be on a rooftop. We're going to be like the Vietnam rooftop, and the Apache helicopter is going to be the rapture. It's just going to pull us out while the world just finishes its final collapse.
Well, even the non-dispies, right? Dispensationalism is obviously Jesus come back tomorrow. Why have kids? It depends which brand, right? But
yeah,
all mill.
Yeah,
All
all-mill, pre-mill. But here's the real question to me. So I'm almost 40 years old. In my lifetime, I can never remember anyone outside of Moscow, in my experience in the Christian camp, who is optimistic about the culture, about Christianity, about the church.
Yeah, things are going to be great.
Everybody.
You don't even know.
Yeah, from day one of my existence, people are like, it's getting worse. We're going to hell in a handbasket. I mean, you name it. Hell in a handbasket theology has dominated the church culture. It's always, we're losing. So in the midst of that sort of thing, I think, naturally, you're not going to have people who are like, oh, let's build a 40,000 year plan. If you think you're losing, why would you?
Some of it, it's imagine a distiller making a barrel of whiskey, and he's putting the, just fresh spirit into the barrel, and he's filling the thing up. And if someone was like, that whiskey's not very good yet, And he's like, I know.
Yeah, just throw it out.
Of course, it's not good. That was a terrible Scottish accent. Yeah, I'm not good at that accent. And he's like, well, just wait. Like, you guys, we're in early church history still. I'm convinced. Like, we're still in early church history here. We're maybe the whiskey's just starting to take on a little bit of color from the freshly charred oak barrel that it went into. Yeah, taste it and, drop a little, what's the little thing that they use to pull out? They use the dropper to pull out glasses. As if you've ever seen a master distiller go through, he's going through the warehouse of barrels, various ages they've been aging for, various number of years, different barrels, different oak, different batches. So they're all different. And he's pulling out just an ounce or two at a time. Actually, they're pretty big pours. That guy must be like wasted all the time. But, and they're trying it like, no, this one's not ready. This one's not ready. And I just picture the Lord Jesus doing that with his church, where we're this big barrel that's just, and he's like, oh, it's getting some color on it now. And we're the equivalent of like the Octomore 5 year. It's been in for a minute, although that one was finished. So that's a bad example.
Oh man, Octomore is good.
So good. But that to me is like, the very opening of the first episode of the King's Hall podcast, we talked about understanding where you are in the story. One of the main problems with revivalism, I think we agree on this, and I want to hear what you guys think, but is that the story that it's telling it's that you're at the Vietnam War, the very end. We've got maybe 15 minutes left of history at any given moment, and everything's on fire. And that's proof that I'm right, by the way.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Anything bad is proof I'm right. And so I'm only going to focus on bad things. Do you know what you're not doing if you think you're in the last 10 minutes of the Vietnam War? You're not building a Christian hospital. You're not starting a Christian school. Why would you do that? The Viet Cong is like right outside the gates.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And this may be totally tangential, but it got me thinking about what changed in the 20th century. Because for a long time, the church was post-mill.
Yeah.
And I'm reading Pat Buchanan's book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. And he makes a statement in that book that I combine with a couple other theological things I've heard about post-mill, where the post-mill, non-post-mill guys who are evaluating post-mill, they say, well, look, World War II taught us that, post-mill can't possibly be true. I never understood that comment. And then I was reading Pat Buchanan, and he says that World War I and II was in large part the death of Western Christendom, because you had these guys were all related, and they're killing each other, slaughtering each other, tune of 50 million people in 2 wars.
Professed Christians in both sides.
Yeah, basically like white Western Christianity just slaughtering each other senselessly. So I think that put a dent in it, and I think that has heavily shaped, plus revivalism, has shaped people's view.
Absolutely.
Of the post-mill.
Yeah, and I think, so with revivalism, we got 15 minutes left to live. World War III is going to happen. That's. You hear
nuclear.
This narrative. It's going to be, we're going to get nuked. Hopefully Israel's going to be okay, and whatever. I don't know.
Hopefully Israel's
what did this be say? I don't know.
Well, the Antichrist makes a strong covenant with Israel, and then the 3.5 year mark, he breaks it, and then the second half of the Great Tribulation is marked by Israel's persecution.
Yeah, I don't know if you recall from the last episode, but dispensationalism, premillennialism came about at the same time
exactly
as all of these other horrible movements, such as Mormonism and Seventh-day Adventists. And
it wasn't on day 2 of the creation.
No.
In fact,
no, it wasn't.
Let me interject my third heading, because we're literally just my outline was meaningless today, and that's fine. Like for this episode,
can't even finish a thought.
I'm gonna let you finish your thought, Dan.
Okay.
But this is a perfect example of it. That revivalism and decisionism it has produced a culture of restorationism and novel theological thinking.
Yeah,
that's
very
deep.
novel.
Yeah, it's interesting, and Dan, I want you to continue.
Yeah, once again,
point here.
In a moment, Eric will also let you continue your thought.
Then
after we both interrupt.
Yes, one interruption to set you up, because I love you so much.
We're cueing you so good right now.
We're just cueing you up.
Cueing me for the thought that I don't really remember. But here's the difference. You were talking about how if you've got 15 minutes left.
Did you just interrupt me while I was interrupting you?
I really wasn't paying attention.
If you've got 15 minutes left.
How do I feel like I've been bulldozed the whole episode?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Here I am. I finally had a thought.
Go. King's Hall, Civil War.
All right. I'm going. Okay, so you got 15 minutes left. You're not building schools. You're not building hospitals. You're not doing any of that stuff. And then you're like, okay, Mr. Grand Vision Post Mill, let's see this beacon of hope, Ogden, Utah. And you come to the city and it stinks. There are flags of the rainbow flags everywhere.
Right across the street.
Yeah, right across the street. I mean, in high defiance of the holy and living God, they are flying his symbol of, anyway, here we go.
Buy my candle.
So, and then you come into Refuge Church, into the
We
sanctuary.
should tell them about that.
Yeah,
Keep
okay,
going.
All right. That's after hours.
Oh, after hours. Okay.
If you want to hear about the candle
That I may or may not make and
you
get us
have
canceled.
to be a patron to hear the
It's
after
true.
hours.
And the candle, you guys.
So you
So
come into
good.
the sanctuary of the somewhat derelict and somewhat beautiful Refuge Church building.
Yeah.
And you hear the music and you're like, wow, I thought they were singing glorious 4-part songs. When we're learning them,
We're learning that.
the cacophony of children screaming sometimes outweighs whatever's being done in worship. You're like kneeling to confess and you hear my kid crying.
Where are the
And
tenors?
they're not confessing. They're actually sinning during confession. There's all these things going on and you're like, wait a minute. This is the post-mill hope. You know what's happening behind the scenes of the small duties that are happening Sunday to Sunday every week is that in faithfulness, the people of God are coming together to worship the holy and living God, being made and knit together by eating the same food, producing children that love the Lord, have a sense of place, know their duties, know what they're for, and they will have children, Lord willing, in 5 generations. Ogden, Utah will actually be a beacon of hope because there will be Christians here. There will be 100,000 Christians here.
Lord willing.
Hundreds of thousands of Christians here. Lord willing. All because of the small things that we do week to week. That's the glorious mission. And it looks not glorious in the moment.
And you guys might be like, you're deluded. That's not going to happen.
Yes,
Here's
I
the
am
thing.
deluded.
Here's the thing.
I have hope
Here's the
that
thing.
the King of Kings is sitting at the right hand of God.
Amen. If we're wrong, we're not going to be wrong about the whole story. We might be wrong about the next act in the current act of the next chapter in the book that we're in.
Yeah.
And actually, maybe, America falls as an empire and there's just like mass unrest for 600 years. Sometimes God decides to write that into the history. It's like maybe there won't be an Ogden, Utah in 200 years because of World War VI. And we're like, we've only had 2.
Yeah. It's like a farmer that plants in hope.
Exactly. Sure. But what we're doing and what we're talking about is how every single generation of Christians ought to be thinking.
Yes.
They ought to be thinking, how can I disciple the nations right where I am? And hey, my Father doesn't give me meaningless tasks that are impossible. He doesn't say go disciple the nations and then intend to just be like, oh, and by the way, you're going to utterly fail and be frustrated
I'm going to
for your
thwart
entire
you at every
life.
attempt to obey me.
You're like, thanks, Dad? I think? It's like, no.
Who comes who gives every good and perfect gift?
Yeah. Oh, he's just building his spiritual kingdom. It's going to be really super spiritual. It's going to be really super spiritual. And, but you won't be able to see any of it like anywhere ever, but you'll be able to feel it if you emote your way towards it, spiritually speaking. It's like every generation, if we all lived this way and we all just said, what furrow can I plow the next 2 feet of in my entire life? I'm going to be a small, insignificant mayfly in the pursuit of this glorious thing that God is building. And that to me is like what revivalism does is it makes every single Christian life, because it's restorationist and it's all about novelty and big and glorious things in every single Christian life. It's like it makes every Christian life about what really the whole Missio Dei should be, where it's like my life will be this glorious story where I do all these great, amazing things and I feel deep spiritual fervor at every moment of every day. And then it just sets literally everybody up for failure.
Yeah.
Because very few people do all that impressive things. The 3 of us, take the whole of Refuge Church, everybody here now, it's very unlikely that any of us will do something historically impressive, like vanishingly unlikely.
Yeah, there are hundreds of years of human history where there's like roughly nothing known.
How many total
if you're-
names did you learn in your first, 12 years of education? Like a couple hundred?
I feel like you're forgetting Santa Baby, though.
That actually might endure.
That might actually endure.
I don't even know if I've watched the whole video, so I don't
See,
know.
Dan hasn't even watched Santa Baby all the way through.
What?
I watched part of it. It was funny.
My son, my oldest,
But then it
my
was Brian
14-year-old,
singing it.
actually in St. Brennan's wrote a similar. He said, "Well, Brian did his, so I wrote this poem."
Oh, yeah.
And it's none of it's repeatable.
Oh, no. I'm just kidding. I was like, wow, we might need to do some discipline
We
at
had
school.
something to confess on Sunday.
Let me say this. It's definitely in the realm of will get you canceled. One of the things, though, that I was thinking as you guys were talking about that, I think we have to fight against generational amnesia. I think we have to fight against the novelty rush of every year, new products, new everything. Think about Twitter. There's a new news cycle every 5 seconds on Twitter.
Yeah, seriously.
Like yesterday, I was like, get the jab or you're the devil. And then today I'm like,
oh, yeah.
But today, that was yesterday. Dan.
Yesterday, sorry.
Yeah, yesterday.
But today
Old
it's
news.
Ukraine. And Zelensky is a hero. I don't even know who he is, but he's a hero and we should worship him.
Yeah, I'm Crane. We're Crane. You Crane. We're all Crane.
That's right. So one thing that I would say just very practically is be reading people. I think on the agriculture side, there's a lot of good people that you can read who actually still embody this mindset.
Mm-hmm.
I think of people like Alan Carlson. I think of Joel Salatin, Wendell Berry, C.R. Wiley. They capture a lot of this pietas, a godly piety that looks to the generations. But I also think about people like David Chilton, Andrew Sandlin. Be thinking and reading as a way of thinking, but be reading and thinking in a generational way. And over time, what I found is you slowly start to see the world differently.
Yeah.
You got to train your mind for that.
You start thinking of the world covenantally.
Yeah.
And you start thinking of the world in historically rooted Catholicity.
Yeah.
Where you start, when I say historically rooted Catholicity, I mean, you start to see yourself as situated on some branch of this great tree that is the universal church. You start to see yourself as connected historically, that your roots go back all the way through the medieval church, through the early church, to the apostles, and obviously Christ is the vine. This metaphor is not perfect, but you start to see yourself connected to that. And in this long view, you start to see yourself covenantally, like covenantally meaning, what is God's covenant? What is he doing? What has he said that he's going to do with this whole world? And how do I fit into it? Like, that's why at the beginning of this whole thing, again, we started with such emphasis on the story that God's telling, because again, like so many of the things that any story that is not accurately situating ourselves in the story God is telling will ultimately produce a culture that fails. Revivalism fails because it sees itself as this restorationist, like, oh, if you look back in church history, even 10 minutes, everything was wrong. And now we've gotten to me and my crazy historically novel doctrine that I received in a vision. And now all of a sudden it's like you see yourself as like a different tree from what the tree that God has planted in the story that he's telling. And it's like any story that just doesn't properly situate yourself in the story that God's telling, the culture that it makes is going to be terrible, because God is actually telling a good story. Like, this thing is actually a pretty dang good story that we're in.
That's right.
I never would have included the Reformation. Like, my story would have been much more linear. But then God was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have some popes, and they're going to have like mistresses.
Like multiple popes at the same time.
Like, there's going to be 3 popes.
Three
okay?
popes.
Someone's
Lots
going
of
to be
popes.
selling Get Out of Hell.
I'm a pope.
People are going to be selling Get Out of Purgatory quicker coins or tickets in order to build houses for the worship of me. And he's like, the story God's telling is really, I don't know where I'm going with this, but anyway, I think the story that God's telling is fascinating. And like a lot of the problems that we have are when we start oversimplifying and telling these like restorationists, they always end up where like, we're the great white hope. We're the great hope that shows up and fixes everything.
And again, so I want you to talk men being made for glory, men and women being made for glory. And so it sounds like at some times we're disparaging against glory, against those moments where you're like, you just crave that glory that comes from the moment.
Yeah.
And so are we disparaging of glory for men and women?
Dan, that is a great question. And I absolutely see what you mean, because it might sound like we're saying Don't be radical. Don't do anything impressive. Just
your
be
paperwork.
lame.
Do your paperwork and cook.
We literally talked about data entry. Like that was our
man.
obey God in your data entry.
I feel
You'll
like I
stand
could have
before
used a
kings.
better example.
No, it's a good example actually. But here's the thing. What you have to actually believe is that God, in giving you the duties he gave you to walk in for your whole life, like these normal duties as a husband, a father, whatever vocation you have, a mother, a wife, God, in giving you those duties and telling you to obey him in them for your whole life, he knows what he's doing. He actually knows what he's doing. And God really is bending all of creation and this whole story towards glory. But what you'll find is that when you aim for shallow, quick glories, big, fast, and famous type glories, revivalistic, emotionalist type glories, me just manufacturing this great, magnificent, unique call of God on my life that nobody else has, and he told me in the watches of the night, through my liver shivers, what we're actually going to end up doing is creating a really lame, stupid story because we're just not God. Like, we're not God. But if you just boringly fulfill your duties, man, God will actually do glorious things. God will do glorious things. He really, like, men, you are the glory of God. Women, you are the glory of man. You really should want glory. You should be pursuing it rightly in the glory of God in your life. But instead of wasting our time with this revivalist thinking that just manufactures fake glory, we ought to pursue the real, authentic number, which is obedience to the duties that God has given us in the place that he's deployed us. And so to wrap it up, we say no to revivalist thinking. No. We say no. We say get rid of that. Let's burn that shanty town to the ground. And instead of that, let's build historically rooted, plodding, long haul, conquest thinking, sober-minded, stable Christian Catholicity. Amen?
Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the King's Hall podcast. Remember that if you join our Patreon with every episode, we release an after-hours show that we record literally moments after recording the main episode, where we talk about related things, a little bit more informal, share toasts with one another. It is a great time, and we would love to have you join. You can go to kingshall.org. We have links to all of the ways to support the show. Yes, you can send us Bitcoin, and we do hodl. So with that said, Festinolente, make hay slowly, and we will see you next time.